Hello, listeners. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. If you are a longtime listener, welcome back. There are some new, exciting things happening with the podcast. First, if you want to keep updated with new episodes and what we have coming up, make sure to find us on Facebook and like the page. You can also make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to the podcast. Second, we are in the middle of a fundraising drive. We are looking to expand our reach and add more resources for production so that we can keep bringing you interviews from around the city. This includes finding new people interested in conducting interviews in their neighborhoods, but we need the financial support of the community members like you. To donate to the podcast, go to paypal.me/facesofgp. That's Faces of GP. I'm so proud to be bringing value to my community with educational and informative information to my neighbors in the city, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support. My guest today is Scott Jeffries. He's the director of the library at Dallas Baptist University. Today, Scott and I talk about the job of a librarian at a university and some of the day-to-day help they give students. We talk about how to think critically about what you read in the news and discuss the obstacles students face in the current online landscape, as well as helping young people understand original source material and point of view. Being a literary and news junkie myself, I found this conversation especially enlightening, and I greatly enjoy discussing the nuances of the university library system and hearing how students are being helped to research within it. And now, here's Scott. Hi, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Jenna. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad that you agreed. And some people that have never been on a podcast or never done an interview like this before are like, okay, I'll do it. I don't know what to expect. So I'm glad that you agreed to come.
Well, I listen to a ton of podcasts, so I can just kind of imitate what they do.
Oh, good. What podcast do you like the most right now?
Oh, I like a lot of interview ones. I know that's how a lot of people are, but sometimes it's just about current events or whatever. But I like interviews, like to hear people's story, kind of get underneath the hood a little bit on how they do things. And
yeah.
So The Moment is one that I really like. Brian Koppelman. Okay. I really like that one. So that's one I listen to quite a bit. Tim Ferriss, I listen to that one quite a bit. So those are two kind of that focus on the interviews.
It's funny because I don't know if you notice it, but I'm seeing a shift, and this is why I'm doing the podcast the way that I am, in these interview type, forums where people have conversations that are longer than just a couple minutes that you see on like a blurb here and there. It's longer conversations, and people are loving them. I mean, when you look at the numbers of people that are watching some of these YouTube and podcasts, I mean, it's pretty astounding.
Yeah, it's so much better than just, hey, tell me some interesting story the last 3 minutes, and then that's it. You don't really know the person.
Right.
And it takes, a lot of times it takes people to really a while to warm up. So it's like 45 minutes into the conversation, and then it all starts to kind of flow and be interesting and that sort of thing.
Right. So people know who you are. So Scott and I actually went to church together for a number of years. And as adults, I go to church with some of the people I interview here. I went to church with as kids, but we got to know each other as adults. And you are the librarian over at Dallas Baptist University. And so you and I were talking the other day on Facebook, and I said, I think people would really value some of the things that you have to add to the conversation. And so that's why you're here. And so I'm just curious, what made you want to become a librarian? Like, what was the instigating factor in that?
Well, I don't run into too many people that's their life goal is to be a librarian. And I didn't really think a whole lot about it, but I've always loved information. I've always liked to be a person that knows a little bit about everything. And so I was a little bit of a nerdy kid. I mean, in that sense, I would read Sports Illustrated cover to cover and get mad if I didn't finish it by the time the next one came out. And so that was the kind of person I was. In college, I would go daily to the library to read the newspaper. Really? And so I just, yeah, I mean, but you have to think about it. This is mid 90s. How else were you going to find out information? You're on a college campus. I'm not going to be watching the 5:30 news. So I'll just go over to the library when I get a break and read up on some things. That was the only way you really. I went to Howard Payne University in Brownwood. So it's a small Baptist university. Plus it's in Brownwood. So it's not like that there was a ton of things for me to go be doing. And so I would go to the library on a daily basis. And so that was just always an interest. I liked libraries. I was on the basketball team there at Howard Payne. And this is how nerdy I was. I would go whenever we went on road trips and went to a different campus. And I was just kind of like to do my own thing. And so I would, everybody else, the rest of the team is kind of gathered, watching whatever games before ours. We're there an hour and a half or 2 hours before the game starts. And so I'll sneak off and I'll go to the library on campus. So we went to another school. We're waiting to play our game. We got some time to kill. And so I go to the library on campus just to kind of check it out. See if I find some books I'm interested in that I can't find in my library. I just kind of had that library. I enjoyed library, the vibe of it, that sort of thing. And so, but my degree was in communications with emphasis on public relations. And so, but I'm not a very good long range planner. And so I just kind of went semester to semester and I hadn't really planned out what my career was going to look like. And so I kind of got down to the end with that, not a whole lot of options. My dad suggested, why don't you go to library school? And so you actually get your master's in library science so that those that work at public library that are librarians, those that work at school libraries, largely they're going to be ones that have gotten a master's in library science. And so my dad suggested it. For most places, yes. Like university libraries, whenever we hire a librarian here, they have to have a master's in library science.
Interesting.
And so I didn't know much about it, but I thought, okay, grad school, might as well do it. I don't have much else going on. Hadn't really planned ahead. It'd be nice to have in my back pocket. I wasn't really hugely passionate about it. I didn't think that's what I was going to do long range, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made because I've never had any trouble finding a job from that point on. And it really, it's kind of how God will work sometimes when, he knows you better than you know yourself. And so I recognized later on that this was the best fit for me because I kind of can continue that love of learning and discovery and knowing things and information. Also, I enjoy helping people. I enjoy teaching. And so I can kind of blend those two, especially on a college campus, that really fits who I am. So it's been a great decision.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think that I'm glad you brought that up because you're not just a librarian, you're a librarian at a university. And so after you graduated, is that the first job that you had was at DBU or did you go somewhere else first?
So I was already working at colleges because I used my communication degree and worked for their media relations department and then specifically their sports information area. So what I was doing was writing press releases about the different teams, making sure that the local media outlets had the stats and the information about the latest game and that sort of thing. Back then, we didn't have quite the web presence, so it's kind of like local newspaper, that sort of thing. So I was already working. I worked at Howard Payne after graduation and as their sports information director. And then I went to a junior college in West Texas, South Plains College in Levelland, Texas. Mm-hmm. And I was working for their media relations area, doing a little bit of just college media relations, but also the sports information side. So I was already working in colleges, but I was going to finish up my master's. in library science. And so I finally finished that up after a couple of years. And the HR person at South Plains College I knew pretty well, was friends with, and they had an opening in the library, and I hadn't even finished my degree yet. And they hired me in the library, in the college library there. And it was a perfect situation for me. I needed a change. Things were a little bit stressful, and I was a little bit overwhelmed. And so it was a great opportunity. And so I was already working in colleges. And so that was kind of the natural move. And then eventually went to Hardin-Simmons University, worked in their library, and then came to DBU. So in the academic environment is really kind of where I kind of want to be, because it's just a different vibe. You're focused more on the learning and supplementing the learning and doing some heavy research. And it's more than just, hey, here's the latest bestseller, which is fine, and public libraries are great. But it's a little bit more developed and expansive and wide variety of things.
Or why people are going there are different. You know, when you're going there as a college student, there's an end goal for you to go. You would pick out books you might not normally have picked out just to read by yourself. You know, so that's a good point. So, like, what is your day like? What is a typical day like for you as a librarian and as a librarian at a university?
Well, now that I'm director, you know, I kind of take on the management side of things. But as far as everyday librarian here at DBU, in this previous role I had, I was one of the reference librarians, and so helping the students with their research. So they've been given an assignment to do a research paper, and they don't know where to start. And they've been told by the professor, you've got to use certain types of resources, and they've got to be from our databases, and they've got to be even peer reviewed, and all these terminology that they aren't familiar with. And so they come to us, and we know exactly what the professors are looking for and what the requirements are. And so we start to work with the students on finding the resources that they need for their research papers and starting that research process. And then another thing that we'll do is go to the individual classes. So a professor will ask us, can you come to our class to teach them the whole class about how to do research and that sort of thing. You know, one of the things that we've discovered is that today's students have been online, they've been searching their whole life, but still they're not familiar with academic research.
Oh, that's such a good point.
So they're just, we think that they're already savvy about research and that sort of thing, but they're really not, because they're just like any of us. They just go on Google and hope for the best. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And we teach them, you know, here's what your professor is looking for. This is what it means to have an academic source. And this is how it's different than what you might just find out there on the web. And so those are some of the things that we focus on and help our students with.
That, you know, one of the things that I did in the last probably 2 years, and I was starting to work on when I actually was doing this podcast, one of the projects I had was I was trying to study the city of Grand Prairie through the 50s and 60s, like the civil rights movement. And I was trying to figure out, how did the local newspaper report on events? Because I was trying to figure out what happened. And then I was trying to figure out, how did they report on events? And since we still have people alive that lived during that time, was that the same as the experience that the people had back then? So I was trying to do a lot of just different parts of this. And so I ended up getting a subscription to newspapers.com, which is essentially just it's archived papers from all over the world. And it's not all complete. There are parts that, you know, there's certain types of papers that you have to actually go to the library and look at, you know, the microfiche to look at. But it was fascinating to me, because that's a totally different way of researching than just Googling something and figuring out what pops up. Because right now it's almost like you could type in any topic and the results will pop up. But when you're looking through a newspaper or something like a book, where no one's telling you what it says and you have to actually find it. It's, first of all, it's a lot more time consuming, but second of all, it teaches you, it's just a totally different way of coming at something. And I don't know, I think that you're touching on something that might be really important for maybe even high school curriculum and high schools to understand. Like, how do you prepare kids to search in an area where searching is so prevalent in certain ways, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge. I mean, we think that our students are media savvy, and just because they're technology, they've got the tech side of things down, doesn't necessarily mean they know how to locate things, and as you're trying to describe, how to recognize how this source is different than the other source. So yeah, and then the value, as you're realizing, of primary sources. So you're trying to get to the newspaper that's actually reporting about what happened in 1956. That's much different than somebody writing about it 30 years later. There may be some value of the person writing about it 30 years later, but there's also extreme value to see how it was written, what they were saying, how it was reported back then. And so the primary source material is really important. And so that's another aspect that students don't think about, is connecting, that stuff from the original story, the original context, all that sort of thing is important.
Yeah, it's and I think the other time I was going through, and in this society that we live in right now, where nobody really knows if what they're being told by the press is true, and then you got to go do all this stuff. It started getting me really interested in so if you go back to like disasters that happen in the world, catastrophes or really evil things that came up, like as an example, the Holocaust in Germany. How were journalists writing about it then? And did they notice that there was a problem? Did they see that there was? And so that was really fascinating to me, was has this problem really changed over time, or have we always had an issue with trying to discern what's true and what's not true? Have journalists always had a slant? Have they always had that? So going back and looking at those primary sources and seeing what they said is so very important, because you see the patterns over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's and it's something that's just, like you said, it does take a little work, and it's not going to be a 10-minute Google search, but it's just incredibly valuable. And a lot of times our students kind of think that the professors, when they say, okay, I want you to use 2 primary sources, and I want you to use these 4 sources that come from academic resources or academic databases, and the students think that they're being tortured. But really what the professors are trying to do is to expose them to these things that are really going to be valuable, help them grow in their knowledge, expand their understanding, see things from different perspectives. There's this kind of hierarchy of how we learn, and Bloom's taxonomy is the terminology that we use. And so, most learning is you hear it from the professor, you regurgitate it on a test. And so what professors are trying to do with research papers, essays, is to get them to the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, which is evaluation, which is synthesis, analysis. And you really can't do that in a test setting or a quiz. You have to do it through a research paper or an essay, or evaluating different resources and gathering different materials. And so, these kind of things aren't just academic torture. I mean, they're trying to push the students to the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which is where more robust learning is happening, which we all could benefit from.
Yeah, I wish we could all go through some of these classes. Every time I see something that kids are learning, I'm like, can we learn that as an adult? That would be fantastic. That's such a good point. And also having, another thing too is, I think that people when they read something or when they are trying to search, okay, so let's say that you're already starting from a particular conclusion. You've decided that you already know the answer to your problem, and you're going to search to find the ways that your answer is correct, as opposed to getting yourself a hypothesis and saying, I think this might be this way. I'm going to see whether I'm right or wrong. And I think that too many times there's this tendency to just find the things that make you right, as opposed to trying to find what actually is the truth. And that could be in any number of topics. You know, even if it's like, I feel like voters in my city don't vote because they can't get to the voting booth. That's my goal. You could find any number of things that support that idea, but the real answer is my answer true or false? And let me figure out what the truth is. Do you find that to be true a lot?
Yeah, I mean, most of our students, I teach them to research in reverse, and they may not like this, but is to do some preliminary research first before you choose what your thesis is, what you choose, what your conclusions are. They think that it's easier to go ahead and map it out in their head and then find the resources, but what they end up doing is kind of shoehorning stuff that doesn't really work. It doesn't really relate. So what I teach them is do some preliminary research first, see where the research is going, and then let that shape what your paper is going to look like. Now, sometimes you may do that and you're like, well, I don't really want to write on this area. I want to write on this particular thing that I'm very passionate about. But again, from an academic perspective, if you don't have the resources to back it up, the information to back it up, then it weakens your argument. So, you know, we kind of have to walk into topics with an open mind. And I know it's hard these days because everybody wants to have an opinion. Everybody wants to have a hot take on something. But we really need to walk into things with an open mind and then see where the research takes us. Now, open mind doesn't mean we're just floating in the wind, right, and just consume everything and just go from there. We're all going to have biases. We're all going to have tendencies to think a direction we want to go or direction we think is truthful or more fitting. But we can't force our beliefs or even our opinions, at least from an academic perspective. People do it all the time in their own relationships or whatever. But it's important to kind of let the research show you. You know, I was watching the other day, I don't know if this relates or not, but I was watching the other day that movie Knives Out.
Yeah.
And so the detective was basically saying, I'm going to let the truth fall at my feet, you know? And so the whole movie is basically, he kind of already knows what's going on, who's at fault and what the whole scenario is, but he's letting the pieces just kind of fall at his feet. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the movie, it's all there. And so that's a little bit of what we're doing with research and sometimes librarians call themselves detectives, you know, trying to make it sound cool. But
that's exactly,
you know, we're letting the truth, the facts kind of fall at our feet. And that's a healthier and a probably more productive way of doing it, even though there's lots of uncertainty there and there's some things that twists and turns that may get a little frustrating. But it's a better process than just saying, here's what I believe, and I'm going to track down whatever backs up that bias. And sometimes I'm drawing from resources that aren't really reliable and aren't worth my time, but they're the only ones that are saying this. So I got to embrace it. And that makes us look bad.
Yeah, I agree. And you bring up a good point. This wasn't something I talked to you about previously when we kind of talked about what we're gonna say today. But since I've got an academic librarian on the talking to me, I'm going to ask you something I think that we don't talk about enough, or maybe that we forget, is the different forms of writing and the different reasons why an author is writing something. So, you know, you're trying to figure out what is the perspective they're coming from. Are they trying to persuade me of something? Are they trying to educate me on something? Maybe talk about that, because I think that that also affects how the types of sources that we see, and not understanding that, okay, you could be reading something where that person is also having a thesis from a long time ago that he's trying to prove to you. So being able to determine, is this source reliable in terms of finding the truth? Because is this person telling me the truth, or are they telling me something that they want me to know? I don't know. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So whenever I talk to students about evaluating resources, especially on the web, we talk a lot about, okay, who is the source? Who is writing? You know, it doesn't take much effort to find out a little bit about them. You know, are they from a university? Are they from a think tank? Are they a researcher in some way? And so find out a little bit about the author. And through that, you start to recognize, okay, this is the perspective that they have. And so that's important. You know, when you go on the web and they don't have a very robust about us page, you know, that tells you a lot about what that kind of research source is doing. And so there's lots of ways that you can kind of recognize where people are coming from. Also, you know, you mentioned the newspaper. We were helped by the structure of the newspaper. And you think about it, we don't have that now. In other words, so like I pull out the business section, and so I know everything I'm going to see in here is about business. Or I'll pull out the opinion section or the editorial section, and that tells me that what they're saying is going to be largely opinion. It's going to be editorial in nature. It's not going to be hard and fast journalism that's just reporting on something. Well, the actual structure of the newspaper was helpful because it was broken up in sections. And so think about what we experience now. We're on Twitter and we see something that shows up from the Dallas Morning News or New York Times or whatever else, and it may be purely an opinion piece, but we don't know that. Our students are people younger than us that never really looked at a newspaper. They don't know the difference. They don't know that this is opinion versus you know, real reporting. They just see it all the same. And so I've looked into some studies about, with college students that, you know, their really inability to recognize misinformation, false information. Like they showed them in this particular study, I forgot the exact scenario, but they showed them like video footage from Iraq or someplace in the Middle East, and it was clearly doctored, but they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't figure out that it was fake, you know. And so again, we kind of go back to our college students. Just because they're tech savvy doesn't mean that they are media savvy, and then we're not doing them any favors, but just this feed of information that just comes flowing at them. And some of the structures and the old way of doing things, even in a newspaper, even in a book, aren't there anymore. And so they've got to really interpret things a lot more than we ever had to. I don't know if that makes any sense. But.
Oh, it absolutely does. Because things were labeled, and it was very, you know, it would say, if you go back through, you can even say op-ed, or like back in the day of the newspaper when it was really with the Associated Press, where they would have one story that they would write from like maybe New York, where they had a lot of journalists, and they would send it out to all the local papers because they didn't have maybe a whole lot of journalists or whatever. You could tell that this story came from the New York Herald in 1865 or whatever. So even though you're reading it in the Kansas paper, you know that it came from a New York paper. That's one thing that we don't have anymore. Is there are these stories are dispersed into other sources, but a lot of times it doesn't say this is from this. It just appears that this is what the source says. And you're right about the identifying it as an opinion piece versus a reporting piece. But one thing I was thinking about as you were talking is this is the value of reading a book and reading actual literature in school as a young person, because you can start discerning tone, you can start discerning verbiage used, you can start seeing what is education, what is something that is with devoid of emotional rhetoric, and what is something that has a lot of emotional rhetoric. But when we teach kids, especially, to read passages that are designed to get them to understand the language, instead of not always encouraging them to read real books that they can see those patterns, it makes it even that much harder when you don't have those things identified for you. Because I try to do a good job of determining, what am I reading? How emotional is it? Does it feel like this is this person's opinion, even if I might not be told that? And then I go, well, that doesn't make sense. Or wait a second, I didn't, why is he not mentioning this? And then I go back and I'm like, oh, this person is trying to get me to see, is trying to convince me of something, even though that's not clear. So I think that that's a hole that we're missing as kids grow up.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things that is great about higher education is it does help teach critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. That's basically what you're describing. Mm-hmm. And that's something that so many people are lacking. When we have critical thinking skills, we're able to recognize our own assumptions, or the assumptions that the author is making, or we're able to question the data, like how are they presenting the data, or where did they get it, or we start to work through the implications. So if I go along with this person's thesis, what is going to be the results? And so if I consider the implications, oh, that's going to take things into, a really dark, dangerous area. Maybe they're not quite where they need to be. And so critical thinking is incredibly important, and something that our society is really lacking. And colleges do a pretty good job, at least someplace like DBU. There's even sections on a required courses that they have to take here at DBU on critical thinking. And they'll have sections that they have to do some kind of critical thinking exercise, or it's on the test. And so they get to practice the critical thinking areas. And that's really what we need to always kind of question ourselves. I mean,
100%.
Like my daughters, my daughters are teenagers. And so their information gathering is through Instagram or TikTok. And so they come to me this past May and they're like, Dad, did you know that they discovered an alternate universe on the North Pole? And I'm like, now what? And so, yes, they discovered that there's alternative, parallel universe on the North Pole. And so I'm like, okay, where did you find this information? Like, I saw it on Instagram. And so I dig into it a little bit, and it's from like one of those New York Post or New York tabloid papers or websites that is based on a science article that happened 3 years before, that talks about how there's these weird waves that happen on the North Pole that they don't really know what they are. Well, these tabloid people and these people that want to get things to go viral grab onto, hey, they don't understand what this is. Let's go with the wild theory that it's some kind of parallel universe that that's some kind of alien thing, and so that gets passed around on TikTok, and my kids are like buying into it. And so it took me like 5 minutes to recognize, okay, what's the source? Well, you can't trust this source. This is based on a science article from 3 years before. Why are they digging it up now? They must be digging it up now just because it sounds interesting and sensational, and it'll get some views. You go to that website where it's originally published, and it's like this explosion of ads and scantily clad women everywhere. I mean, it's just like nothing that doesn't scream validity and reliability and something to trust. I mean, so there's all these different clues that I could put on just a little bit of my critical thinking hat and realize this thing was not going anywhere. But that's something my kids were buying into and tell me about, like they were really informing me of something that was groundbreaking.
Trending topics is almost pretty dangerous, because one of the trending topics that I saw a few months ago was that Helen Keller wasn't really a person, and I was like, surely they don't believe this. But there was an explosion of videos on TikTok about Helen Keller not being real, and I was like, where does this even begin? And so as a kid now, I just don't know how. Well, for one thing, we have got to, as the adults, as the generation before them, we have got to take all these kids under our wing and mentor them into how they're going to navigate this, because you and I were raised in a time where we didn't even have the internet, and then now we have the internet, and and it's just mentoring them. But like, as a librarian, you've seen, and even being in college, you said you were in college, going to college in the mid 90s. So you've seen where things have just changed so much over the last 25 years. So how does the job as a librarian, how has it shifted now from where it started then, maybe when you started?
Yeah, so from an academic perspective, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is working on our space, meaning the space of the library. Like, what are the amenities that we provide? Like, do we have comfortable seating? Do we have quiet zones? Then do we also have group study zones? And so from that perspective, kind of a physical perspective, we're trying to create a second place, if you will, for learning to take place. Because they have their dorm, which there's going to be lots of distractions. And so much of learning is happening in second places like coffee shops or Starbucks or at a library. And so we spend a lot of time in trying to create a place that students can really feel comfortable to learn and discover. And I even claim, and some professors get upset with me, I claim that more learning happens in the library than anywhere else on campus. And certainly they're gathering information in the classroom, but they're really learning it in a place like the library, because they're having to wrestle with it. They're using some of those critical thinking skills. They're questioning things. They're having to research extra stuff. They're writing and forming their own thoughts. They're studying with a group. And so the learning is largely happening in those kind of settings, and that happens in the library. And so that's kind of a different thinking that I thought when I first started, when it's just about the resources and how we're presenting the resources and getting those to the students. And so that's different. And then kind of what we've already talked about is just helping them recognize the difference between all the different information that's flowing at them.
Yeah.
And that they've got to go a little deeper. They've got to find the academic resources. They've got to find things that have been rigorously tested, rigorously researched. There's been a process to it. Hard-worn knowledge is kind of, it's didn't show up on the book just the next day. It's had to go through a lot of rigor and review and those sorts of things, and that means something. So teaching the students that sort of thing has been a challenge, something that's a little bit different. And then just the mass of digital options. I mean, we have electronic databases that when I first started, we had those back in the late 90s, but then it only went to like 1985 or 1991. Now it's going back to the 40s. And so you have just this explosion of information. And so research librarians, academic librarians have to be able to put on their expertise in different subjects. And so that's a challenge for me. You have to, in a smaller library like DBU, we have to be generalist. And so I'm not just a business librarian that's what I do all day. I've got to know a little bit about all these different things. And so that hasn't really changed, but still the explosion of digital options are out there, and just making sense of all those and getting those connected to the students where they're at. Obviously, in the middle of the pandemic, we've had to ramp up our digital outreach and delivering the materials and the research to the students in an electronic form, which has definitely been a challenge at times. So that's a little bit of the change in the progression there.
Well, you talked about something that I never even thought about before, and I don't know why, but you were talking about having the resources there that are, that the students have to actually look through. So how does a library, and maybe you could talk about like the difference between the university setting and maybe like a public library, how does the library go about deciding what books go onto shelves? Or, I never even thought about that.
That's a great question, and I think there's even professors here, don't tell them, that don't understand that. So it probably varies on academic libraries, but our library our collection is faculty driven. In other words, they tell us what they like us to order. And so they request items that they want us to order. So that makes sense because they're developing the curriculum, they're developing the courses. We want to trust them to direct us to the materials that's going to be most helpful for their students. And so it's up to our faculty to kind of tell us what to order. Now, certainly we fill in the gaps and we order our own things and we try to beef up our collection here and there. But from an academic perspective, that's where we're coming from. From a public library, it's largely up to the librarians to develop the collection. And so they're going through review magazines and things, kind of trade publications that have a lot of book reviews, and they select items for the library. And so, there's some days that I'm glad that we have the faculty telling me what to order, but there's some days that I wish that I could just do it. Because you can imagine certain areas are better than others, just because this particular year professors were right on top of it and they're sending us all the greatest stuff. And then the next year it's some other area. And so we have a few inconsistencies, I think, through our library. But to answer your question, that's kind of how most colleges work. And public libraries, largely the librarians will be the ones that make those selections. Certainly we get input from the students. From a public library is going to get input from citizens or users, friends of the library, that sort of thing. But that's largely what we're doing in the academic library.
Wow, that kind of makes you think that professors have a great deal of influence on the kind, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is. If you have these resources in the library of which you're trying to fit the resources you have to the classes you have, and a person is trying to research maybe a different point of view for that particular topic, you're kind of limited. Well, and of course we have any book we want at our fingertips, online, but just having it there, it's kind of interesting to think about that. What do you do with the books how do you decide when a book needs to be thrown away, or what do you do with it when it's at the end of its life?
So we try to do what we call weeding quite a bit. You look at the date and then you look at the topic. So if I'm looking at something on psychology from the 40s, then I've got to think that there's been 60 years of more research and development on that particular topic. And unless it's like a just rock solid legacy type expert, famous psychologists, we're probably going to get rid of it, just because even the professors in psychology will say to their students, I don't want you using materials that's 5 years or older. Only use the things that are 5 years or up to now. And so they have those restrictions. And so we have similar restrictions to how we handle our collection. But if it's history, or if it's biblical studies or something, then stuff from the 40s and 50s may be better than what's coming out now. And so it kind of depends on the topic.
So you probably have a pretty large religious portion of your library with religious.
Right.
That's so interesting.
And to go back to your kind of what you were referring to earlier, it is a challenge from a librarian perspective to stay true to kind of the belief system in a Baptist university, but also sprinkle in the other side of things, or other denominations, other belief systems, because people need to be exposed to those as well. And so to kind of appropriately add those in a way that's not overwhelming, kind of what our belief system may be or what our professors are teaching, but also is a healthy supplement to what they're learning in other areas. So that's kind of a challenge from my perspective. I get pushed back at times as a director about some of the items that we have, and then I have to make the case. So this is why this is important that our library has this. And then there's some cases when a book comes across my desk and I'm like, there's no way we need to have this in our library. Yeah. It's not helpful. It's heretical. It's, even satanic at times, and you can kind of go down those roads. And so there's no reason for us to have this. And so you kind of have to have some discernment and some understanding of what's appropriate and what's not.
That's such a good point. And probably we could have a whole nother episode about this particular topic, but y'all being a Baptist university, there's a lot of different types of universities all over the country. And, in certain universities, ousting the thing that you don't believe in is becoming a huge issue in a lot of college campuses. And obviously you as a librarian that has a finite amount of space, if you're going to have books, you can't have every book that ever existed on your you have to make those decisions. And I like what you're saying about making the case for why something should be there, or making the case for why something doesn't need to be there. And you're not making a judgment on the actual book itself. What you're saying is, for our reasons at this university, this is why this needs to exist, or this is what I think that this needs to exist and not. But having control over what they see, this is something that, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is something I've heard. Students now have a really hard time reading things that they don't really agree with, and they want it to, instead of just existing, they want it to just go away. Are you seeing that more with college students, or do you see that with the teachers or the adults, or are you noticing that?
Absolutely. And it's so antithetical to the academic process. I mean, I don't see why people think that that's helpful, because what you're doing is you're saying, this bothers me, and so I want to dump it. I'm going to trash it. Well, if you're able to actually engage it in a way, that's what you do in higher education. That's what you do as you try to learn. You engage different points of view, different beliefs. And college should be a place where that happens in abundance, rather than in a very limited way. And so it really is almost doesn't make any sense that colleges would be at the forefront of cancel culture, if we will, of trashing these things, when in reality they should be the areas where more of this is happening. And so I just think it's just a terrible precedent. Now, being at a Christian college, there's definitely some challenges with that kind of mindset, but I don't know if everybody would agree with this, and I don't know if DBU administration would agree with this, but I tell a lot of students that this you're going to be questioning things anyway at this age. And so what better place to do that than a place like DBU, where there's going to be safe. You're not going to be in radical thinking, in radical mindset. You're going to have professors that care about you and don't have an axe to grind. They're going to be helpful, is walking you through the questioning, walking you through your belief system. I mean, that sounds like a great environment to learn and grow and ask those questions.
Yeah.
But instead, we just say, "Oh, you don't like it? You're triggered.
Yeah.
Don't even go there."
Yeah.
I don't see how we grow. I don't see how anybody grows in that mindset.
We don't, and and it's so easy to just banish the things that and I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I would not say that I'm like a trigger happy person. There's things that bother me, and everyone has that. There's things that you read that just go, oh my gosh, I don't like that at all. But it almost feels counterintuitive now to, instead of just going no, to embrace it in a way that you can control a conversation. You don't have to, I don't mean control the outcome of a conversation. I mean, when you banish something, you no longer have control over that thing. There's no way that in a debate you can have it, because now you've just removed it completely from everything. That doesn't make it go away. It just means you don't have to see it anymore. Whereas if we can pull those people, pull that thing in, or pull that idea in and go, let's discuss it in a way that I, as the university, or, as a parent or as a teacher, I can control how we discuss it in a way that is good for everything. And it's not easy to do. It really isn't. If you really see something that you don't agree with, an idea, an ideology, or whatever, and Christians, have a hard time with this when it comes to outside Christian influences. To engage in those discussions, it's difficult. It is. It's very difficult, and it's counterintuitive, but it takes practice. And if you get better at practicing it, it becomes, you start to change. You almost start to welcome it in a way that's not like, yeah, I get to discuss this today, but you do welcome it. And what it does is it leads you down different paths. And I think that is, when we go back to what we originally discussed, the long form interview, where you invite someone onto a program that you have a different perspective, and you hear how people can not even debate. They're not even debating. They're just discussing an idea, and you can remove your personal opinions about it enough to be able to hear someone else's perspective and then say, I don't agree, but I respect that they could discuss it. That's something we've got to get better at. I don't know how to influence it other than just to create that space here and invite people to do it with me, but I don't know, that's just, I've thought a lot about that.
Yeah. And I just think we need to be okay with being exposed to a wide range of things. And we never have been in a better time for us to be exposed to a wide range of things, but right. Yet that makes us really nervous. And I know as a parent, I get it. You are nervous about exposing your kids to a wide range of things, but I think you can still do that in a class setting, in your household, among your family, in a way that's safe, that's educational, that provokes discovery, that critical thinking. And so we have all these tools, but yet we want to just go into our bubbles and just live there. We only hear kind of confirmation bias. We only hear that echo chamber of what we believe, and we get stifled. We get limited. We get small. And as a educator and as somebody that's always enjoyed information and learning a little bit about everything, I don't want to be there. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be small. I don't want to have a small bubble of what I know. but it kind of goes back to what we talked about the whole time. It takes critical thinking, it takes maturity, it takes good mentorship and teachers, all along the way. And unfortunately, kind of I mentioned my kids and TikTok. I mean, that's their teachers. Those are their mentors. And that's pretty scary.
Parents, it's terrifying. Like, we don't need to just leave them to their own devices and let other kids teach them about things like alternative universes on the North Pole.
Right.
Or that Helen Keller didn't exist. That's
right.
terrifying. You know, and I think too, we have to take back the responsibility to do that ourselves, because one of the things that sparked our conversation was, if we expect other people like the press, or we expect the government, or we expect these large people to be responsible for us, to tell us what we need to see, and we don't take it upon ourselves to understand how to think critically, and then to teach the people that we directly influence, our kids, our students, you know, how do you determine what information, and I say students, but I'm talking really at a university level where you have these critical thinking classes, you know, and you have the opportunity to have those conversations. But even in just, you know, just in church, and if we can take those opportunities ourselves and take that responsibility on, and that's not to say that, you know, journalists and, you know, news outlets and authors and all that stuff aren't responsible for what they put out in the world. They are, but we can't expect for them to change things. We have to change things ourselves. This is where we're at, right? I don't see social media giants changing things tomorrow. So until that happens, we have TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and probably a gazillion other things that you and I both don't even realize exist. And like, so we have to teach our kids how to navigate in it. And it's really not easy. And I think that having gone down some of these social media sites myself for the purposes of having a 10-year-old daughter, to understand what she's going to see, it can be pretty disturbing, and it's kind of scary. So it's like, okay, as a parent, I can either say, no, you can't ever see that, or I can say, this is what I've seen, let's talk about this. And that's hard to do. Right.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure as a parent. And yeah, I appreciate them coming to me. Maybe one of these days they'll stop doing it because I keep refuting what they tell me about the parallel universes on the North Pole. But a lot of times they'll come to me with the latest thing, and I'm like, well, this is what's really going on. And so I have that opportunity to kind of teach them or show them a resource that kind of refutes that. And so, yeah, but it's a challenge. You know, I've got one that's in college and one that's about to be in college, you know, and so I worry about kind of leaving them on their own. And as far as our college students go, you know, it doesn't hurt. I bristle a little bit as a librarian because people think we're just a warehouse of books. And I'm like, as a college library, you know, 85% of what you're going to be doing is going to be digital. And so, but their mindset is all books. And so I'm trying to refute some of that and gear them towards all of our electronic resources. But, you know, there's value to a book because it took years for it to be published. And so the information in there is a little bit dated, and that's a good thing. It's a little bit more heavily researched, and that's a good thing. It's a little bit more, it needs to be a little bit more timeless in a sense, and that's a good thing. And so, you know, we need to kind of expose our young people to things like books that is a different approach to information that may be healthy in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, it absolutely does. And you know, going back to like, and I know we only have just a couple more minutes, but going back to the newspapers and reading those newspapers, one thing that I kind of didn't even think about was the patterns of things I saw from like the 50s. As an example, I started realizing that none of the women were referred to by their name. If they were saying like, okay, let's have a party, we're going to have a baby shower for so-and-so's daughter. Well, instead of it being, you know, Jenna Pecor, it was Mr. So-and-so, so-and-so, or Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so. So it was like they referred to you by their husband's name. And I didn't even think about that. But then when I go through and read it, I'm like, that tells me a lot about the time that I'm reading in. And I think sometimes there are words or phrases or ways of writing things that you can go back into time and be really offended about, or really, they really hurt your ears to hear now. But it just tells you about the time that you existed. And I'd go back to newspapers and I'm like, this was basically social media. It just was in a newspaper form. I mean, it's so interesting when you go through it and be like, so-and-so's daughter was home from college and they went and had lunch at so-and-so's house. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're basically just writing in to tell everything that happened in real life at that time. But that's valuable too. If you can read it with the attitude of, I'm going to have this perspective that I'm learning something that I might not have even have thought about, it blows your mind. You're like, oh, that's just so interesting.
Yeah, and we need to be encouraged to read more. And it's weird to say, because since we have these devices and we're reading all the time, but are we sitting down with a book or an article and spending 10, 15 minutes of just focused on that, that develops some muscles, some thinking muscles, and some media savvy muscles that we've talked about, rather than just this feed and this constant stream of things. That's reading in a sense, but it doesn't allow me to dwell on something, doesn't allow me to really think about something, doesn't allow me to ask these important questions. And so we need to kind of be able to practice some of our reading muscles and our thinking muscles. And unfortunately, that's harder and harder to do these days, because we're all losing our attention spans, and everything's got to be really fast and move on to the next thing. But I think just as we exercise our muscles, we practice spiritual disciplines or whatever, we need to practice some of these mental exercises as well, by opening up a book or reading an article cover to cover, or a magazine cover to cover, just to practice some of these things that I think we've lost along the way.
Yeah, I agree 100%. But well, I really appreciate you talking to me today. I think that we could go on and have a whole nother discussion, because there's just so many interesting things to consider about today's landscape. But I really appreciate you taking your time, Scott.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks, Jenna. And I know librarians are the most exciting people to have on a podcast, but I really appreciate the time.
Hey, I find them very interesting. So I think that it's awesome. So, all right. Well, it's good seeing you. And yeah,
it's nice to see you. Have a good day.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.